Govt2305, Introduction to Federal Government, the Constitution, Bulwark of American Government, Chapter 2, Introduction. In this chapter, you will discover the roots of the Constitution in early America, see why Americans declared independence from England, and learn about their first government under the Articles of Confederation. Follow the arguments that shaped the Constitution and the debate over its adoption, and learn how Americans have changed the Constitution and how the Constitution has changed America. After completing the modules in this chapter, you'll be able to describe the features of colonial politics that propelled the new nation forward in its Constitution. Explain why the colonists revolted. Distinguish between the two parts of the Declaration of Independence. List the strengths and weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Outline the 6 broad issues that the Constitutional Convention sought to address. Describe the major sections of the U.S. Constitution. Compare the positions of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in the debate over the ratification, and explain why it's so difficult to change the United States Constitution. As I stated in the chapter's welcome video, the importance of the Constitution cannot be ignored. This rather brief document has served as the bedrock of our constitutional democracy and as the framework for the structure and organization of America's governmental institutions. But this was not the original form of the government that the founders and especially the states had in mind. Our original form of government was not a republic but a confederacy, which is a loose alignment of states. But there were great problems with this early governmental system that the founders were forced to address head on. Since it was based on handshakes and promises between the states, all the power went to each individual state, requiring the states themselves to work together for the nation's common good. What little power the central government had was useless unless the states themselves would find a way to unite. This was not possible until the founders devised a stronger way to bind the states together, and that was the Constitution. As Alexander Hamilton said of the founders, "We are attempting by this Constitution to abolish factions and to unite all parties for the general welfare." To most observers at the time, this sentiment was wishful thinking and highly improbable to accomplish. But it is a miracle that the founders were even able to write and adopt the great document. To say that there were a great number of discords and disagreements would be an understatement. There were strong regional, philosophical, and political differences between the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Southern and northern states had opposing viewpoints and cultures when it came to the government and politics. The South was heavily based on agriculture and foreign trade, while the North was highly industrialized and much less dependent upon the labor-intensive Southern plantation way of life. Slavery was more than a way of life in the South. It was their life's blood. Not only was the institution ingrained in the cultural fiber of the Southern states, but it also was necessary for the economic stability of each Southern state. Cotton and tobacco were the cash crops of the South, and both were highly labor-intensive. And for this reason, Southern states were bound and determined not to lose their sovereignty or their cultural and economic base. But in the North, the Southern way of life was seen as immoral and based on the pain and suffering of African slaves. George Washington, a Virginia slave owner himself, said that it appears to me that then little short of a miracle that the delegates from so many different states should unite in forming a system of government. John Adams, a moralist, said, "I always considered the settlement of America with reverence and wonder as the opening of a great scene and design in providence for the elimination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind over earth. As we can see, The Founding Fathers themselves approached the writing and adoption of the Constitution from very different perspectives, and those same differences are inherent in our society today. This infographic presented in your textbook shows us some interesting facts about the Constitution as we break it down by the numbers. For instance, 6 is the number of the 13 states that voted for the Constitution within 6 months, but the Constitution required 9 states to ratify, so the founders had a ways to go before it became the law of the land. 2 is the number of states that initially voted against the Constitution. 18 is the number of delegates in New York, Virginia, and Massachusetts. 3% of the delegates in these states who could have defeated the entire Constitution simply by changing their votes. More than 11,600 is the number of proposed amendments to the United States Constitution that have been introduced in Congress since 1791. But 17 is the number of successful amendments that have been added to the United States Constitution since the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. 202 is the number of years after it was originally introduced that the most recent, the 27th Amendment, was passed in 1992. 3 is the percentage of the United States population that can block a constitutional amendment. And 28 is the number of states of the 2/3 required, or 34, that have agreed to a new constitutional convention as of 2020. Before we move forward into this chapter's modules, let's take a look at what you should be watching for in this chapter. First, ask yourself, what were the geographical, cultural, and historical roots of American politics that led towards the need for a constitution? Second, what were the key features of American colonial life that propelled the country towards the adoption of this new form of government that we know as a constitutional democracy or a constitutional republic? Third, what were the forms of discord and disagreement that were prevalent among the framers of the Constitution, and how did they influence the document we have today? Fourth, what role did compromise play in the adoption of the Constitution? And lastly, are there any lessons that today's politicians could learn from in observing the attitudes and behaviors of the Founding Fathers as they constructed this document?